Okay. All right, Quinn, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. I'm Quin Cho. I am a fellow at Pacific Atrocities Education. I've written 3 books that were published by PAE, including Competing Empires in Burma, a chronicle of the China-Burma-India theater of World War II, The Battle of Wuhan, China's Resilience Amid the Shadows of War, and The Rise of the Kwantung Army, Japan's empire in Manchuria to 1932. The latter book is the first of what I intend to be a 3-part series on Japan's Kwantung Army. I am currently writing the second volume of that series as of we speak right now, and I intend to have it done some point in the next summer. With regards to my background, it was a history and international relations major at the University of Southern California. I graduated in the fall of 2023, summa cum laude, and I intend to go to graduate school in the near future and hopefully continue publishing books about the history of the Second World War in the Asia-Pacific region.
Great. So let's start this episode with a statement from Senator Ted Cruz, who recently claimed that China is engaged in a 1,000-year war against the United States. Let me play this clip.
But the Chinese are engaged in a 1,000-year war against the United States. And their objective is complete and total global dominance. The United States, we are often slow to action. We tend to slumber on threats. But I think more and more people's eyes are opening up.
Okay. Now that's a bold statement, and let's unpack it. The US
Yeah,
has only been around 249 years, so how does this timeline work?
Yeah, obviously, Senator Cruz's statement is on its face false. As you pointed out, the United States has only been in existence for 249 years since 1776. China, on the other hand, has existed for over 5,000 years as a continuous civilization. There is quite the gap between the two countries and their relative ages, but more importantly, and to the point of Senator Cruz's claim, it's literally impossible because the U.S. Is not even old enough to fit his 1,000-year time frame. Worthy of note is that even if one disregards the factual inaccuracy of the 1,000-year conflict claim, there actually was quite a bit of cooperation or admiration, even, at least at first, among the U.S. founding fathers for China.
Yes. So given your extensive research on Asia Pacific region, can you clarify the historical timeline of the interaction between China and the United States, especially in the early 20th century?
Yeah, of course. With regards to the U.S.-China relations, and this is kind of going into my point that I was going to make, is that the U.S. founding fathers, many of them did admire China and saw it as an example of bureaucratic governance, societal harmony, and the like. There was a burgeoning trade between the U.S. and China in the 19th century from the American East Coast, and eventually as America expanded west, this began to take place from the West Coast as well. Now, there were certainly examples of American aggression against China in the 19th century, most notably in the form of the Treaty of Wangxia,
Was it a
which,
part of the manifest destiny?
yes, in a sense, it is a continuation of America's manifest destiny, which includes the American continent and eventually expands into the Pacific Ocean. So you have the kind of seeds of this that are laid with the first unequal treaty in 1844 in the Treaty of Wangxia, which allowed the U.S. to have extraterritorial rights in 5 treaty ports, fixed tariff rates, and most favored nation status. The Second Opium War, where the U.S. actually landed 150 troops at Guangzhou in the Battle of Barrier Forts to defend its extraterritorial territorial interests. And then in subsequent decades, you also have American attempts to establish market presence in China, and most notably, participation in the crushing of the Boxer Rebellion. However, in the 20th century, and this goes to the crux of the question, you actually see a reemergence of cooperation between the US and China in the first half of the century, particularly during World War II, when the US and China were aligned in their fight against Japanese aggression and imperialism. While there was another period of waning in US-China relations between 1949 and 1972, after the founding of the People's Republic of China and America's rather hostile attitude towards it, in 1972, President Nixon visited the People's Republic of China and uh, uh, created the groundwork necessary for a U.S.-China rapprochement, which began in the 1970s and 80s, with especially after China's reform and opening up in 1979 under the.
Well, let's go back a little bit in time for the 20th century. Your work on competing empire in Burma really highlighted the complexity of international relations during World War II. So how would you describe the US-China relations during the 20th century? And what does that tell us about the so-called millennia-long conflict?
Yes, I think that's a very good and interesting question, and I think that it requires some detail to answer this properly. So I mentioned the existence of the various waxing and waning periods, I might call it, of US-China relations, which some of which were defined by cooperation and alliance even, and others which were defined by conflict. I think that the most obvious period of cooperation is in the Second World War. And it is, I think, that period of which I have dedicated a lot of research to, and which I think deserves the most in-depth examination. So during the Second World War, the United States and China uh, obviously fought against Japan, but the U.S. and China supported each other in various ways in the course of the conflict. So in 1941, the United States sent roughly 100 fighter aircraft to China, along with hundreds of airmen and ground crew, to defend the Burma Road, which was the means by which America and other Western countries sent war supplies and oil and other wartime necessities to China. This was
And they were
despite
flying
the
the
fact
hump too, right?
there's also flying the hump, yes, which occurs during World War II. The flying the hump is a term that references these American transport aircraft flying over the Himalayan mountains, because after Japan invaded Burma in the winter and spring of 1941 and 2, the was necessary for the United States to fly in supplies via transport aircraft over the Himalayan mountains. The American pilots that flew these supplies in, and C-46, C-47, and Dakota DC-3 transport aircraft referred to the Himalayas as the hump, because it was a rather dangerous route defined by mountains and sudden gusts of wind and the like that they were flying. For the record, flew in 685,304 tons of supplies to China.
Yes,
There
and I
was
remember
also
reading one of the pilot, it was pretty interesting. They were saying, well, you have a box of currency in your cargo, so if you crash, you can use that. And the pilot said, well, if I crash, I'm just going to die. So can you tell us about like the danger of flying the hump?
Yeah, so the flying the hump is incredibly dangerous for a variety of different reasons. For one thing, the quality of the aircraft themselves, particularly the C-40 transport aircraft, was a little bit questionable at times, with pipes due to likely to freeze, and the kind of hydraulics and various
Yes,
mechanical
because
systems on the
when they
aircraft
were
not
taking off,
functioning properly, because it's is very cold, obviously, in the
But
Himalayas
when
and
they were taking
certainly in
off,
altitude.
it's like humid and it's tropical, right? And then as
Yep.
they go over the cloud,
Yeah.
it freezes, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also due to the limitations of some of the aircraft they were using, which had notable mechanical problems. Then you also had actually at certain points the possibility of being intercepted by Japanese fighter aircraft operating from northern Burma. You also had the level of flying low and in between the mountain passes because of the limitations of the service ceilings of certain aircraft. If you flew the hump enough, there was a rather decent chance that you may not come back.
And even before flying the hump, there was the flying tiger. Can you go into that?
Yes, of course. So the Flying Tigers, as I mentioned earlier, were a volunteer group of American pilots and aircraft that were put together by Claire Chenault, who was an American aviation officer who was in China and went to, as an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, and went to America to get support from the American government to allow for the dispatch of experienced uh, pilots, or at least, if not experienced, at least volunteer pilots is probably the correct term to use. Volunteer pilots and ground crew to defend the Burma Road that was funneling supplies from the ports of Burma into southwestern China. That was the main objective of the Flying Tigers, and it was to do so while America was not at war with Japan, at least in a nominal sense. It was in a sense, a kind of proxy force for the United States in China to prop China up against Japan's aggression in 1941, before December, when America eventually gets involved after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The dispatch of the Flying Tigers to to China gave them a a certain combat experience against Japanese aircraft and Japanese fighters. There were several new tactics that were pioneered, most notably the so-called boom and zoom, in which American P-40s, which had a superior dive and climb rate to Japanese fighters, would suddenly appear out of the clouds on high or from a higher altitude against their Japanese counterparts, suddenly just dive upon them, strafe them, and then subsequently use their superior rate of climb to climb up away into the higher altitudes.
And Senator Cruz, let's go back to Senator Cruz's statement, which suggested 1,000-year war, but the U.S. has only existed for 249 years. So, from a historian's perspective, how do you approach such a historical claim? And what does that say about the use of history in political rhetoric?
So, back to Ted Cruz, I think that his statement is obviously not a factual one, and that I don't really need to do much to debunk it on my own. A simple Google search on the existence of the United States, how long it's existed, will suffice in that regard. However, the statement is a reflection of a broader anti-China climate in the U.S. that has steadily been rising, I'd say at least for the past decade, and if not longer. In my observation, there seems to be a faction or factions within the American security and intelligence apparatus that want war with China. This is evidenced by the U.S. Armed Forces adjustment of its doctrine and armaments systems, most notably the Marine Corps' adoption of uh, anti-ship missile batteries and their abandonment of tanks and their uh, supposed status as a combined arms force. You can also look at the United States Navy's adoption of distributed lethality, which is designed to counter China's anti-access area denial asymmetric anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles from destroying concentrated American assets. The idea is that America can spread out China's attention, the attention of its sensors, radars, satellites, etc., and command apparatus to limit the damage done to American vessels in the Asia Pacific region, and also the, I guess you might say, the lack of the willingness to distribute American assets throughout the second and third island chains, which are farther away from China's coast and a potential sudden missile strike. These actions indicate America's willingness and, in some quarters, seemingly a desire to prepare for conflict with China, and Cruz's attempt to sloppily, I might add, rewrite history is an attempt to benefit this geopolitical and strategic agenda. And such revision of history is a attempt at brainwashing the American population, which is not the most historically literate and primate for a conflict with China.
And so the Kwantung Army, which I have a copy here, the Kwantung Army's action in Manchuria was they're a key part of your current project, right? So how do historical misrepresentations like Cruz's claim compare to the strategic narrative used by Japan in the early 20th century to justify expansion?
So there are some similarities between the narratives Cruz used and those prominent in Imperial Japan during World War II. However, there are some notable differences due to the situations being different. So one similarity, I would say, is Cruz's statement of a 1,000-year conflict being between the U.S. and China, and Ishiwara Kanji's idea of the final war between Japan and the United States, viewing East and West as being inevitably at odds and destined to fight. Ishiwara, for reference, was a colonel in the Kwantung Army that initiated false flag attack at Mukden in 1931, and thereby also facilitated Japan's and the Kwantung Army's conquest of northeastern China. In Ishiwara's case, his prophecy of a U.S.-Japan conflict eventually came true because he initiated an invasion of northeastern China, which eventually led to war with China and eventually the United States as well, without getting into the details too much.
You can go into the detail, it's okay.
Okay, so if we are to go into the details, I think it's the invasion of northeastern China and the subsequent conquest of northeastern China by the spring of 1932 eventually leads to the necessity of securing the flank of northeastern China to the west and preventing the Chinese from ever being able to invade the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. So in 1933, Kwantung Army, without the approval of Tokyo, invades this province called Rehe, which is immediately to the west of the puppet state of Manchukuo. 1935, there are a couple of agreements that are made between the Japanese and the KMT authorities in Hebei province and Chahar province that strip the KMT of its right to have political organs or conduct political activities in these regions or station troops belonging to the nationalist armed forces in the region, in either of these regions as well. The Japanese capitalized on the vacuum of the absence of the KMT to promote regional and ethnic separatism in these regions, which is something that we also see today being done. And I think that that's an important parallel to note with regards to China. People, I think these powers, these imperialist powers, past and present, have attempted to use China's ethnic and regional diversity against it to try and balkanize it and divide it and make it easier to conquer. But eventually, because of Japan's attempts to do this, so agrees it, Japanese and Chinese eventually went to war in 1937. KMT was which had up to that point been following a first unity, then resistance policy that prioritized defeating China's communists over the Japanese, decided that it could no longer acquiesce to Japan's salami slicing of northern China. And when another incident broke out in July of 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge, it soon spiraled into a broader Sino-Japanese war involving the commitment of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of men, eventually billions of men, across hundreds and even thousands of miles, depending on how you look at it and when you're looking.
So, mhm.
This eventually led to a conflict with the United States because even though Japan, the Army General Staff, assumed that China could be defeated in the space of somewhere between 3 to 6 months, it was not, in fact, able to defeat China in this time period and eventually began running out of key raw materials. These raw materials were very present in Southeast Asia, which was very colonized by European countries at the time, and America in case of the Philippines. But because America's naval assets in the Philippines and air assets as well in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor were a potential threat to Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia and the broader Asia Pacific region, Japan also realized that if it were to conquer the Southeast Asian colonies of the European countries such as Britain and the Netherlands, it would also need to destroy the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and capture the Philippines. And so hence, in 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the rest is history, literally, with
Yes.
regards to the American-Japanese conflict in the Pacific. All that is to say that the Japan's descent towards war was rooted in Ishiwada's idea of the final war and his conception of Northeast China and the rest of Asia as a autarkic sphere for Japan, a self-sufficient sphere for Japan that could be necessarily brought under Japan's direct rule. And the way that this was justified to the populace of the Asian countries that Japan was conquering, and also Japan's own population, was through the idea that Japan had a duty to lead these Asian peoples away from their European colonial masters and towards a future that was free from the deprivations of European colonization. They dressed this up under the auspices of the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was a conception designed to get people in Japan and outside of Japan in Asia to acquiesce to Japan's imperial expansion and aggression during the Second World War. It's noteworthy that while Japan's Pan-Asian paternalism is distinct, and that the kind of idea that Japan had to be the leader of the Asians is distinct to Japan as an Asian country, there are some parallels that can be drawn to America's ideology of American exceptionalism and universal liberalism, in which it's kind of understood that the U.S. needs to export its liberal values abroad to support supposedly backward or lesser people. This is a rather notable similarity between Japan and the United States in their ideologies, respective ideologies in the past and in the present. And so, in summary, I know that was a very long answer I just gave, but Cruz's idea of the 1,000-Year War and Ishiwada's idea of the final war exhibit some great similarities, as do the ideas of Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and Pan-Asianism, along with America's idea of its own exceptionalism and civilizing mission, if you will. So I think those are two notable parallels that can be drawn between imperial ideologies, past and present.
And how might your analysis of past conflicts, such as involving those that, sorry, let me repeat. My dog is doing some crazy stuff. How might your analysis of past conflicts, such as those involving the Kwantung Army, inform our understanding of current US-China tensions? And what lessons can we draw to avoid exaggerating these tensions?
So the Kwantung Army's actions in northeastern and northern China were epitomized in the Japanese phenomenon of Gekokujo, or the lower overcoming the higher. So that is to say that the Kwantung Army's decision to invade northeastern China was undertaken by field officers. That is to say, colonels, two colonels, Ishiwara, who I mentioned earlier, and this other fellow, Colonel Itagaki Seishiro, who is also on the Kwantung Army staff. And their decision to invade northeastern China was done without approval from the civilian government or the higher-ups on the Army General Staff, or indeed even their own immediate commander in the Kwantung Army, a guy by the name of Lieutenant General Honjo Shigeru. While their invasion of northeastern China was successful, it also led to subsequent attempts to invade and balkanize other parts of northern China, most notably Rehe, Hebei, and Inner Mongolia, the process of balkanization I described earlier. This mission creep, you might call it, eventually led to the initiation of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the broader Asia-Pacific War through the process that I described in the previous answer to the previous question. It's also notable that the Kwantung Army's invasion was undertaken in part because it feared the USSR and China would become stronger and would, by 1936, be able to effectively resist Japan's encroachments. And that the US and UK could potentially intervene in Asian affairs after they recovered from the Great Depression. Therefore, the Kwantung Army saw it as being urgent to act in 1931, or at least in the early part of these, so as to make sure they didn't miss their proverbial window of action in which other countries could become stronger relative to Japan and forestall it from attacking northeast China. All of this is to say that there are quite a good many parallels between America's current strategic situation and those of Japan in the late 20s and early 30s. So there seems to be, from what I understand, a failure to control subordinates in the armed forces at both the broad civilian level and at the level of the Secretary of War now, and also the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Mission creep and Windows fallacies playing great roles in the America's various commitments overseas, and most notably with regards to China, because there does seem to be a 3 to 5 year window that the U.S. is prioritizing to try and engage in a conflict with China, or at least some people in the U.S. are, on the basis that by 2030 or so, China's technological procurement will be so great that any attempt to initiate war will inevitably be a failure, and so that puts an impetus on acting sooner rather than later. And also the promotion of separatism and the balkanization of China. That's another theme that carries weight in both past and present iterations of empire.
So, as a part of Pacific Atrocities education, you aim to educate about historical truth. And so, how can we ensure that political statements like Cruz's are grounded in historical reality? And what role do historians play in public discourse?
Unfortunately, there is no surefire way to ensure that politicians such as Cruz won't make such blatantly false and incorrect statements. The best we can do is use our platform at PAE to advance historically accurate narratives. As historians, we are the guardians of the past, and it is up to us to provide as good of an account of that past as we can. Making such accounts accessible to the public is vital to ensuring better historical literacy among Americans, especially with regards to East Asia, which most know little about. As keepers of the past, historians have an important role to play in crafting accurate narratives, as many people often see parallels between the past and present. Therefore, it is vital that we are faithful and guardians of the truth and are active participants in its perpetuation.
How do you think statements like Cruz's impact international relations? And what can be done to counter misinformation in this area?
Statements like the one Cruz made are obviously detrimental to international relations. Not only is his statement untrue, but it also pours gasoline on the fire, so to speak, of already poor U.S.-China relations. Cruz's statement would probably seem to indicate a desire for war on the part of many in the United States. From the perspective of Chinese government officials, it must be pretty galling to hear such statements from Cruz, who's clearly out of his depth discussing the history of U.S.-China relations, yet is also a known China hawk. To counter misinformation regarding the history of U.S.-China relations, historians must effectively use the information space, most notably the internet and social media, to our advantage, making short, entertaining videos and posts about the absurd nature of Ted Cruz's anti-China statements could appeal to a broader audience that is fed up with politicians such as Cruz and their endless warmongering. Given the nature of attention spans today, brevity is key to appealing to a broader audience, which is in turn the pathway to countering misinformation on a broader level. That means we must select the most relevant and pertinent facts to share and use them to debunk Ted Cruz's argument.
And it's not just like politicians too. Like I've seen crazy TikTok videos where I see claims that would come out of nowhere. For example, I think some feminists claim that China attacked Pearl Harbor during World War II. And there were a lot of, so I think that if we see like historical inaccuracy in videos and whatnot, we can also comment about what we know about history. And so then we can start a dialogue. On that note, let's go on to the next question. Can you share a bit about your research process, especially your recent work at the National Archives, and how do primary sources help in debunking or contextualizing claims such as a thousand-year war?
So I made 2 trips to the National Archives and scanned documents for 8 hours a day. We both went, so we know what that's like, and it's a very draining and grueling process.
Yes.
But I think it's very important to engage in this kind of activity to ensure the preservation of historical documents in digital archives. Many of these historical documents are in poor shape and are falling apart. Prior to going to the archives, I personally looked up relevant search terms in the NARA catalog and went through the online results. While this was a time-consuming process that took many hours, it was, in the end, well worth it because I was able to obtain a panopticon of useful sources that had a lot of useful information within them. It's noteworthy that utilizing a diversity of search terms is important to finding new sources. One should start out with the simplest terms related to one's project. So in my case, in the book about the Kwantung Army, I should start out with the Kwantung Army and Manchuria, and then branch out and extend once you become more familiar with the archives and sources that others have used. It's important to thread the needle between taking thorough notes on sources and skipping over irrelevant information. That way you can have both a breadth and depth of primary sources that you can cite. Your primary sources separate you as a historian, but it's also important to remember that it's necessary to be selective and to always take into account the point of view, time, and place that is reflected in your source, and account for these elements when you're writing and including citations to primary sources. That being said, assuming that you're able to select your sources well, primary sources can be great tools to debunk false arguments such as Ted Cruz's claim of a 1,000-year conflict, as there is a wealth of evidence that exists in the archives and in personal diaries, journals, the like, which would indicate examples of U.S.-China cooperation, most notably during World War II, but also at other points in history in the past 250 years.
And let's talk about the maps that you use in your book as well. We scanned them well, actually, you scanned them at the maps room at the National Archive. Yeah, do you want to go over those maps that you scanned and put in your book?
Yes, so the maps are part of the War Department maps collection. They were in part of Record Group 77. These were maps that were put together, I believe, before the Second World War because they were necessary for the purposes of intelligence and just reconnaissance. And there were a good many detailed maps of important places in northeast China and also China and Korea and Japan. And you could go to other places in Asia as well and find similar maps from that RG Record Group 77, as it all would have been important for the American war effort. For my purposes, I obviously was looking at northeast China and Korea primarily. I was looking at those maps, and a lot of the most useful maps I found were those about the Russo-Japanese War. I was able to find maps of the scheme of maneuver for the Battle of Mount Nan, which is at the kind of base of the Kwantung Peninsula. Narrow, it's like the narrow neck that leads into the Kwantung Peninsula. That's where Mount Nan is, and I was able to find a map of the Japanese deployments during the battle. I was also able to find a map of the Battle of Mukden, which was the most consequential battle of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. It involved, for reference, I think roughly 350,000 Russians and roughly 300,000 Japanese, to give you an idea of the scale of fighting. I also found maps of just key places in northeastern China, most notably the Liaodong Peninsula and the area around Mukden. Some were in Cyrillic, unfortunately, or in Chinese, which for an English-speaking audience is obviously not the best for the purposes of interpreting a map, but it was still nonetheless interesting to find and useful for me to improve my understanding of the nuances of Northeast China's geography and the relative positions of certain villages, towns, and cities that I mention in my book. So I learned quite a bit from these maps and included them in my book and was very happy to have them and to have the opportunity to scan them at the National Archives.
And there were some disputed borders, and I think I noticed some borders of some maps are quite different than other maps. I think we saw like a couple of different maps regarding that time period, right?
That is true. I mean, what's also notable is the spellings can be very different than even standard Wade Giles spelling. So in Chinese with romanization, you have two main standard systems of romanizing Chinese place names and people names. You have Wade Giles, which is the 20th century version, and then nowadays you have Hanyu Pinyin, which has been in use primarily in the 21st century. Some of the place names do not follow either style. They're
Yes.
very distinct and notable, so much so that it can sometimes be hard to recognize what place they're even talking about. And you have to really kind of think about it to actually understand what you're even looking at.
Do you think that also leads to misconception of China as a country? Because if you can't even think about a place name and then you don't know how to describe it, and you have done this for a couple of years now, right? And
Yes.
so, like a layman understanding of this would be much harder, would you say?
It's hard for historians who are not Chinese to even totally have a grasp on the different place names and their spellings in English. It also doesn't help that a lot of places in China, especially Northeast China, have different names. So, for example, you have the city of Mukden, which is very pivotal, both in the Russo-Japanese War and certainly during the 918 incident, the so-called
Yes.
Mukden incident. It's a very pivotal. It and its immediate vicinity is pivotal to the action of September the 18th, 1931, and Japan's invasion of Northeast China. But nowadays it's called Shenyang, right? It's not Mukden, it's Shenyang. And that kind of presents the dilemma as a historian of, do you refer to this place as Mukden? Do you refer to it as Shenyang? What do you call this place in your book, right? And when you're first reading about it, it's hard to realize that Mukden and Shenyang are actually the same place. Ditto
And
for...
I was also doing a research about the POW camp, which was located in Mukden, and then it was called Hokten by the POW camp was called Hokden. And then when I was actually trying to find a place on modern Google Map, it's Shenyang. And so then Hokden and Mukden and Shenyang ended up to be the same place, which is also very confusing. Even, I'm Chinese myself. And then and the Kwantung Army, I know that is not, it is how people are known. There is how the name is known now, but what would you call it in Pinyin?
In Pinyin, so that pertains to the standardization of Romanizing Chinese or Japanese names. And so the Kwantung Army, the Kwantung Army, would instead in Pinyin be the Guangdong Army, or the Guandong Army. So that is again, a notable difference that is important. I primarily use Hanyu Pinyin in my book to refer to place names. I tried my best to standardize everything, but there were some place names that I just couldn't convert into Hanyu Pinyin, or alternatively, other names that I felt are popular and ubiquitous enough in Wei Giles that I had used the Wei Giles spelling, most notably the Kwantung Army, but also figures such as Chiang Kai-shek.
Yes.
I used Wei Giles Chiang Kai-shek and not the Hanyu Pinyin and Mandarin Jiang Jieshi. So, as you can see, there's quite the difference in linguistic interpretation for many different reasons that can lead to confusion and misunderstanding, even among seasoned historians and students of history.
So how does your Kwantung Army project relate to broader themes of historical accuracy and the dangers of misrepresenting history?
So, my project about the Kwantung Army was the first of its kind in English, as no other historian has written a similar book about the Kwantung Army up to this point. Now, there are many reasons for this. One is that a lot of the sources in Japanese pertaining to the Kwantung Army are in classical Japanese, which is not well known even among Japanese people today. Another reason is that the subject matter is somewhat sticky politically for a variety of reasons. Another is that it's simply quite difficult to write a book about the Kwantung Army and its activities, because a lot of the pertinent historical documents were destroyed in the last days of World War II. Nonetheless, I still took upon this task. I thought that it was worthwhile to better inform the English-speaking public about the Kwantung Army and its various actions. I think we both came to this conclusion in the fall of 2020. And I think that, in part, the necessity of this is made clear by Japan's lack of understanding of the Kwantung Army and its actions during the Second World War. Due to I guess, the prevalence of the Japanese far right and the right-wing control over textbook manufacturing in Japan, there's very little discussion of Japan's nature of its aggressive war in East Asia, or the atrocities that the Imperial Japanese Army committed in the course of conducting the war. The Kwantung Army's initiation of hostilities at Mukden, the encroachments in northern China in the run-up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War itself initiated border clashes with the USSR, and certainly the various atrocities that the Kwantung Army committed in northeastern China, most notably Unit 731, which did biological experiments on living subjects, among other things. The sale of opium and drugs, the utilization of large-scale slave labor that uh, deprived roughly 2 million people in northeastern China, and the deprivation of food and other important necessities in the region. All of these were significant war crimes that the Japanese committed that led to the death and immiseration of millions of people.
And it's very interesting because what we find, Japan had really actively destroyed a lot of evidence right after the war. So what we find is actually like quite a miracle given how they were trying to bury the evidence. And also it is worth noticing LDP stands for Liberal Democratic Party, but it was also started by a war criminal right after the war, Kishi. He was the guy who planned the forced labor in Northeast China. And by naming his party Liberal Democrat Party, a lot of people had mistaken it for being a very left-wing party, wouldn't you say?
LDP is actually a party of former Japanese militarists or people who are complicit and more than complicit even in Japan's wartime efforts and its wartime machine, most notably Kishi Nobusuke, among others. So the idea that it is some kind of free and open party that is in favor of free trade and free markets, and or exclusively interested in free trade, free markets, free speech, free thought, free assembly, association, etc. That those are kind of the tenets of liberalism. That's a little bit maybe off the mark. But that being said, I think that the relative lack of education about the Kwantung Army's deeds among the Japanese has led to this kind of political amnesia, and also has led to the embrace of Japan's remilitarization and tensions with China. I think the recent election of Sanae Takaichi, a China hawk that actively embraces Imperial Japan's, shall we say, uh, questionable past, seems to indicate a lack of understanding of World War II history, as Japan's ultimate defeat and destruction were no small part due to its invasion of Northeast China and the rest of China, which in turn led to the Pacific War. And the failure to understand the strategic reasons for Japan's defeat during World War II has meant that many Japanese have embraced rearmament and another potential conflict with the resurgent China. This time with a certain willingness from circles in the U.S. to back Japan in this quest. So I think that it's quite important to realize the lack of military history and political education in Japan and in the US, for that matter, is a contributing factor to the escalation of tensions between China and also the US and Japan. And I think that it's our job as historians to try and do our best to give a more accurate appraisal of past, in particularly World War II history.
Yes. And in your study of the China-Burma-India theater, you've explored how different empires competed. So how does the historical competition between empires compare to the current US-China dynamics, and what misconceptions might arise from oversimplifying the relationship?
So during World War II, there were three imperial powers, most notably the US and UK on one side and Japan on the other, that fought to preserve and or expand their empires in Asia, or at least they were major participants. There were other countries such as France and the Netherlands, which had been defeated by Germany in 1940 and really had a limited military presence compared to these other three powers. And it's noteworthy that the primary objective that they were fighting for The main prize, if you will, was China's markets and resources. The ultimate economic goal for these empires was to expand and or maintain control over China's markets and resources, in Japan's case through the establishment of an autarkic, self-sufficient Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, inclusive of China and the rest of Southeast Asia, and in the US and UK case through the maintenance of the pre-World War II status quo, and particularly in the US case, the open door in China, the maintenance of the open international system in China. Today, this dynamic has changed, as China has managed to rise from the ashes of the century of humiliation between 1842 and 1949, and it's reemerged to its historical place as the center of the global economy. Nevertheless, there are still those in the US and elsewhere that would prefer to see China reduced back to its previous status. China's state-run companies, central planning, and just general economic situation foster efficient production, which threatens American monopolies and denies them unimpeded access to the Chinese market. Others in the United States and the Pentagon and the CIA and the like, they see China as a military threat in East Asia. Because of these aforementioned reasons pertaining to the global economy and the armed forces, the United States government and security apparatus sees China, or certain elements within the government and security apparatus, sees China as a threat and has attempted to encircle it with military bases in places like South Korea and Japan, Philippines. It has also made bilateral alliances with would-be hostile adversaries like Japan. The first island chain, inclusive of the province of Taiwan, is integral to this strategy. So is the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca. The goal is to deny China oil imports and prevent its maritime forces from getting a window onto the Pacific, so to speak. The U.S. presence in China's backyard, its sanctions on China, and its threat to blockade China's oil imports through the Strait of Malacca indicate that it is in fact trespassing in China's neighborhood and not the other way around. Any attempt to compare China-U.S. tensions to inter-imperial clashes of World War II are off base. I think as English-speaking American citizens, it behooves us to promote peace and cooperation with China and align with policymakers who seek the same. That way, the American economy can remain connected to the fruits of China's industrial plenty and thereby facilitate prosperity on both sides of the Pacific Ocean.
So, how do you see the role of political rhetoric in shaping historical narratives, and what responsibilities do public figures have in ensuring accuracies when discussing international relations?
So political rhetoric can often lead many politicians to reach into the past for parallels and analogies, even when these are not accurate and don't actually fit the current situation. The danger with these inaccurate analogs lay in the fact that they oftentimes encourage the wrong strategic response, or can be used to justify the wrong strategic response. So the idea that, for instance, Xi Jinping is the next Hitler because China is rearming would fit into that category. I think that I've heard that and perpetuated by certain figures on the internet, and I think that that is something that is false and should be understood as being false. American public figures have a responsibility to avoid such sloppy comparisons to the past, in large part due to America's global presence militarily and its rather, shall we say, bellicose foreign policy. The nature of these realities makes it such that any irresponsible comparisons can foster narratives that promote war and can lead to war. Our job as historians is to ensure that the historical record is in fact maintained accurately, and to avoid such sloppy comparisons, to understand both the similarities but also the differences between past and present situations, and to thereby analyze the situation effectively. That way, we can at least have a better chance of preventing the weaponization of the past by special interests and by warmongers.